The elevator shouldn't have gone that high. The number above the door kept climbing past the floors I recognized, past the corporate offices and glass conference rooms, past anything that made sense for someone like me. And I remember staring at the glowing digits like they were counting down to something I didn't understand yet, my fingers still hovering near the panel where I'd pressed the wrong button without thinking, top floor, because I was in a hurry, because I wasn't paying attention, because I just needed to get out of the lobby. And away from the awkward conversation I'd left behind, and now the silence inside the elevator felt different, heavier, like the air had changed somewhere between the 28th and the unknown. My reflection in the mirrored walls looking smaller than I felt just seconds ago, my heartbeat louder than the soft mechanical hum as the car slowed, then stopped, and when the doors slid open, I knew immediately I didn't belong there. It wasn't an office floor. It wasn't anything I could explain. The lighting was softer, warmer, but somehow colder at the same time, casting long shadows across polished marble that looked too perfect to be real, and the silence, God, the silence, was complete, no phones ringing, no voices. Just the faint echo of my own breath as I hesitated at the threshold, debating whether to step out or hit the close button and pretend this never happened. But something made me move forward, one step, then another, like the space itself was pulling me in. And that's when I noticed them, two men in dark suits standing near the far wall, still as statues, but watching me in a way that made my stomach tighten, not hostile, not welcoming, just aware. Like they already knew I wasn't supposed to be there and were waiting to see what I would do next. "I'm sorry," I started, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. I think I took the wrong. I stopped mid-sentence because that's when I saw him. He wasn't near the elevator. He wasn't hidden. He was standing at the end of the hall like he had always been there, like the entire floor had been built around him, tall, composed, dressed in a way that didn't just suggest money but control. The kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself because it didn't have to, and the moment his eyes landed on me, everything inside me stilled, not fear exactly, not yet, but something sharper, something that felt like recognition without memory, like seeing a place you've never been but somehow knowing the way out. Except I didn't want to find the way out. I just stood there, caught between leaving and staying, breathing and forgetting how to, because he didn't look surprised, not even a little, his gaze steady, deliberate, as if I had just walked into a meeting I was already late for. He took one step toward me, slow, controlled, and the men by the wall shifted almost imperceptibly, not moving to stop me, not moving to help me, just adjusting to him, like everything on that floor revolved around the space he occupied. And I realized then that this wasn't a mistake I could laugh off, not something I could fix with a quick apology and a pressed button, because the way he looked at me said something I couldn't explain, something that made my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter. And when he finally spoke, his voice low and certain, it wasn't a question, it wasn't confusion, it was something else entirely, something that made the world tilt just enough to feel wrong. "You're late." I did not understand the words at first, not because I could not hear them, but because they did not belong to me, not in this moment, not in this place, and yet the way he said them settled into my chest like something familiar, something that had been waiting. And I felt my lips part before I even knew what I was going to say. "I think you have the wrong person," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt, though my fingers curled slightly at my sides like they were bracing for something I could not see yet, and he watched me closely, not with suspicion, not with curiosity, but with certainty. The kind that made my explanation feel small before it even fully formed. He took another step forward, closing the distance just enough that I could see the details now, the faint line of a scar near his collar, the subtle movement of his breath, the way his gaze did not waver even for a second. And it was not intense in the way movies make it seem. It was controlled, measured, like he was studying something he already understood but needed to confirm. "No," he said quietly, almost to himself, "I do not." The words landed differently this time, heavier, and something in my chest tightened in response, a reaction I could not explain, like my body was recognizing something my mind refused to accept. I shook my head, taking a small step back, my heel brushing against the edge of the elevator door that had not closed yet. a silent reminder that I could still leave, that I could press the button and disappear back into the world where things made sense, where people did not look at me like I had just returned from somewhere I did not remember going. I just got here, I said, more firmly now, holding on to that fact like it could anchor me. I was trying to get to the lobby, and I must have pressed the wrong button. For a moment, nothing changed, the silence stretching between us, the two men in suits still watching without interfering, the air thick with something unspoken, and then he did something that made my breath catch. Not a sudden move, not anything threatening. Just a slight tilt of his head, like he was adjusting a perspective that had never been in question to begin with. "You always say that," he replied, and my mind stumbled over the sentence, catching on the word always like it did not belong there, like it should not be part of this conversation, because there was no always, there was only now. There was only this moment where I had stepped into the wrong place and met the wrong person, except nothing about him felt wrong. Not in the way it should have, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else. "I do not know you," I said, more quietly this time, the confidence slipping just enough to reveal the uncertainty underneath, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not doubt, not disbelief, but something almost softer, almost human. Though it disappeared so quickly I could not be sure it had been there at all. He glanced past me briefly, toward the elevator, and I felt it before I saw it, the subtle change in the space as the doors slid closed behind me with a soft, final sound that echoed louder than it should have, cutting off the easy escape I had been holding on to without realizing it, and when I turned back to him, my pulse quickening just slightly, he was closer now, not enough to invade my space, but enough that leaving would no longer be simple. Enough that this moment had shifted into something else entirely. "Then we are going to fix that," he said, his voice calm, controlled, leaving no room for argument, and I realized with a clarity that settled deep in my bones that whatever had brought me to this floor was no longer the biggest problem. Because the way he looked at me, like I was something found rather than something lost, meant that walking away was no longer entirely up to me. The words should have sounded reassuring, maybe even polite, but instead they settled over me like a decision that had already been made, one that did not require my agreement, and I felt something inside me push back against that. A quiet instinct that refused to be folded into whatever this was becoming. "Fix what?" I asked, my voice sharper now, steadier because it had to be, because if I let even a fraction of the confusion show, I had the strange feeling he would see straight through it and find something I was not ready to face, and for a second, just a second, his gaze flickered, not away from me, but deeper, like he was looking past the surface and searching for something underneath. "The part where you pretend this is the first time," he said, and my breath caught again, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that I felt it in my chest, a small, sharp disruption that made everything feel slightly off balance. "I am not pretending," I replied, the words coming faster now, my thoughts trying to catch up with the situation that kept slipping further out of control. "I do not know who you think I am, but I have never been here before, I have never met you. And I definitely was not expected on this floor." I gestured lightly around us, the polished marble, the silent hall, the men who still had not moved, all of it too deliberate to be accidental, and yet he did not react the way I expected, no frustration, no disbelief, just that same calm. Certainty that was starting to feel more unsettling than anything else. He took another step closer, and this time I did not move back, not because I was not aware of the distance closing, but because something in me resisted the idea of retreating, as if stepping away would confirm something I did not understand. And when he stopped, there was only a few feet between us, enough to feel the presence of him without contact, enough to notice the subtle details that made him real instead of distant, the faint scent of something clean and expensive, the precise way he held himself like nothing in his world was ever out of place. "Say your name," he said, and the request was simple, almost ordinary, but it landed with weight, like it mattered more than it should, like the answer would change something fundamental. I hesitated, not because I did not know it, but because suddenly it felt like giving it to him meant more than just an introduction, and that thought alone made my pulse pick up slightly, my fingers tightening at my sides again. "Lena," I said finally, the word leaving my mouth slower than usual, measured, careful, and for the first time since I had stepped off that elevator, something in his composure shifted in a way I could not ignore. Not a loss of control, never that. But a subtle confirmation, like a piece of a puzzle sliding into place exactly where it belonged. He exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, and then he nodded once, a small movement that carried more meaning than it should have. "Lena Carter," he said, and my stomach dropped at the sound of my full name in his voice, not guessed, not questioned, stated, like a fact he had been holding on to long before I walked in, and the air around me seemed to tighten. Every instinct suddenly alert in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something deeper, something that felt like recognition trying to surface through a wall of missing memory. "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice lower now, quieter, because the situation had shifted again, and this time I could not pretend it was just a misunderstanding, and he watched me for a long moment, his expression unreadable but focused, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I could handle, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but no less certain. "Because you told me," he said, and the world seemed to tilt just slightly, not enough to knock me off balance, but enough that I could feel it, a subtle shift that made everything before this moment feel less solid, less reliable. And I realized then that the problem was no longer convincing him that he was wrong. The problem was that a small, impossible part of me was starting to wonder if he was not. The answer should not have made sense, but it did something worse. It made me hesitate, and that hesitation felt like a crack in something I had always trusted, my own memory, my own certainty about where I had been and who I had met. And I hated that more than I could explain. "That is not possible," I said, shaking my head slightly, more to ground myself than to convince him, because the way he stood there, calm and unshaken, made it clear he was not the one questioning anything. "I would remember," I added, my voice quieter now, not as firm as before, because the confidence I had been holding onto was starting to slip in ways I did not like. His eyes did not leave mine, not even for a second, and there was something in that steady focus that made it difficult to look away, like he was anchoring me in place without ever touching me. "You think you would," he replied, and there was no challenge in his tone, no attempt to argue, just a simple statement that somehow carried more weight than anything louder could have, and I felt my chest tighten again. That same strange pressure building, as if something inside me was trying to surface, but could not quite break through. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance toward the elevator behind me, the closed doors reflecting a distorted version of the scene, me standing there, him facing me, the distance between us smaller than it had been minutes ago. And for a moment I considered pressing the call button again, forcing it open, stepping back into something familiar, but my feet did not move, and that was what unsettled me the most. Not him, not the situation, but the fact that I was still standing there. "Still listening." "Then explain it," I said, turning back to him, my voice steadier now because I needed it to be, because if I let this continue without pushing back, I was afraid of where it would lead. "If I told you my name, when, where, how, because I know my life. And you are not part of it." The words came out sharper than I intended, edged with something close to frustration, but he did not react to that either, did not take a step back or forward, just watched me with that same controlled focus, as if he had expected the question all along. For a few seconds, he said nothing and the silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, not empty, but deliberate, like he was choosing his next words carefully, and when he finally spoke, it was slower, more measured than before. "You walked into a place you were not supposed to be," he said, and I almost let out a breath of relief because that at least sounded logical, something I could follow, something that fit the situation as I understood it, but then he continued. And the relief disappeared just as quickly. "You were looking for a way out," he added, his gaze still locked on mine, "and you found me instead." The sentence hit something deep inside me, not a memory exactly, not a clear image or moment, but a feeling, faint and distant, like an echo of something I had once known, and my breath caught again, my mind scrambling to place it, to reject it, to do anything except accept it. "That does not mean anything," I said quickly, too quickly, the words rushing out before I could fully think them through, because if I slowed down, if I gave that feeling even a second more, I was afraid it would grow into something I could not control. He tilted his head slightly again, that same subtle movement that seemed to signal he was adjusting to something only he could see, and for the first time, there was a hint of something else in his expression, not doubt, not uncertainty, but something closer to patience, like he had expected this exact reaction and was willing to wait it out. "It will," he said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice made my stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the unsettling realization that this moment was not random, not an accident I could walk away from, and as I stood there, caught between leaving and staying, believing and denying, I felt it again, that faint, impossible pull, like I had not just stepped into the wrong place, but into something that had been waiting for me long before I ever pressed that button. The silence that followed his last words did not feel empty anymore. It felt loaded, like something invisible had settled between us, something I could not name but could not ignore either, and I realized with a slow, unsettling clarity that standing here and arguing logic was not going to change anything, not for him, and maybe not for me either. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding and glanced around the floor again, taking in the details I had missed before, the way everything was too precise, too controlled, like nothing here was accidental, not even me. And that thought sent a small chill through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Okay," I said finally, my voice quieter but more deliberate now, shifting from denial to something else, something closer to control. "Let us say for a second that you are right, that somehow we have met before, that I told you my name, that I was here. Then explain this part to me." I gestured lightly to myself, to the space between us, to the situation that still made no sense no matter how I turned it. Why do I not remember any of it? The question hung in the air, and this time, he did not answer immediately, his gaze steady but thoughtful, like he had been expecting that question too, like it was part of a sequence he already understood. And that realization made my pulse tighten just slightly, because it meant I was moving along a path he had already seen. He shifted his weight subtly, not a retreat, not an advance, just a small adjustment that somehow made him feel even more grounded in the space, more certain, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more measured than before. "Because you chose not to," he said, and for a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the only reaction that made sense to something that did not, my head shaking instinctively. "That is not how memory works," I replied, the words coming quickly, automatically, because that was something I understood, something solid, something real. People do not just decide to forget entire moments, entire conversations, I stopped, the sentence trailing off because something about the way he was watching me made the argument feel incomplete before I could even finish it, like I was explaining something simple to someone who already knew more than I did. "They do when remembering comes with a cost," he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice made the air feel heavier again, and I felt it then, not a memory, not something clear, but a flicker, a brief, disjointed sensation that passed through me so quickly I almost missed it, like standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, like a door closing behind me, like a voice saying something I could not quite hear, and I blinked, my focus slipping for just a second before snapping back to him. "What cost?" I asked, more softly now, because the question no longer felt like a challenge. It felt like something I needed to know, and that shift unsettled me more than anything else so far. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable but intent, like he was measuring something I could not see, and then his gaze dropped, not away from me, but lower, toward my hand, and instinctively, I followed it. At first, I did not understand what he was looking at. My fingers slightly curled, empty, nothing unusual, and then I noticed it, something small, something I should have seen immediately but somehow had not, a thin silver ring resting against my skin. Simple, understated, and completely unfamiliar. My breath caught as I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to place it, to remember when I had put it on, where it had come from, why I had not noticed it before, and the more I searched, the more empty the answers felt, like reaching for something that was not there. "I do not wear rings," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, my voice unsteady in a way I could not control, and when I looked back up, his eyes were already on me. Watching, waiting, like this was the moment he had been leading me toward from the beginning. "You did," he said, his voice calm but absolute, and something in my chest shifted again, deeper this time, more real, as the impossible possibilities settled into place, not fully accepted, not even close, but no longer easy to deny, and as I stood there, staring at something that should not exist, I realized that whatever I had walked into was not just about him knowing me, it was about me not knowing myself, and that was a problem I could not walk away from. For a moment, I could not move, my eyes fixed on the ring like it might disappear if I looked away, like it was some kind of trick my mind was playing on me, but it stayed there, solid, real, catching the soft light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And the more I stared at it, the more wrong it felt, not because it was unfamiliar, but because a part of me deep inside, quiet and buried, did not reject it the way the rest of me did. I turned my hand slightly, the motion slow, careful, like I was afraid of what I might discover if I looked too closely, and my pulse picked up again, steady but stronger now, each beat pressing against my ribs as if trying to warn me about something I could not yet see. "This is not mine," I said, though the words sounded weaker than I intended, less certain, because I could not explain how it had gotten there. And that lack of explanation was starting to unravel the confidence I had been holding on to since the moment I stepped off the elevator. He did not interrupt, did not correct me, just watched, his gaze following the small movement of my hand like it mattered more than anything else I had said so far, and that silence, that patience, made the moment feel heavier, like he was giving me space to realize something on my own. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, and tried to think, to trace back my steps, to remember when I had last looked at my hands, when I would have noticed something like this, because it was not subtle, it was not something I could have missed, and yet here it was, sitting on my finger like it had always belonged there. "I would have seen it," I whispered, more to myself than to him, my voice barely steady now, because the logic that had always grounded me was starting to slip, and I did not know what to replace it with. A faint memory flickered again, stronger this time, not clear, not complete, but enough to make my breath hitch, a flash of light reflecting off something silver, the sound of a door closing softly behind me, a voice low and close saying something I could not fully hear. And then it was gone, leaving behind nothing but the echo of something I could not grasp. I blinked, my focus snapping back, my chest rising and falling a little faster now, and when I looked up at him again, I realized he had noticed, not the memory itself, but the reaction, the slight shift in my breathing, the way my posture had changed. And something in his expression softened just enough to make my stomach tighten. "You remember pieces," he said quietly, not asking, not guessing, just stating it like a fact, and I shook my head immediately, instinctively, even though a part of me knew he was not entirely wrong. "No," I said, more firmly now, pushing back against the feeling, against the uncertainty that was creeping in. "I am imagining things because you keep saying things that do not make sense." The words came out faster, sharper, like I could force them into truth if I said them with enough conviction, but he did not react to that either, did not argue, did not push. Just held my gaze with that same steady focus that was starting to feel less like control and more like something else, something patient, something that had been waiting longer than I could understand. "Then take it off," he said simply, and the suggestion caught me off guard, my eyes dropping back to the ring, my fingers instinctively moving to it, testing the edge, expecting it to slide off easily, because if it did, if I could remove it without effort, then maybe this was nothing, maybe this was just a strange coincidence, something I could walk away from and forget, but as I applied a little pressure, just enough to shift it, I felt it resist, not painfully, not forcefully, just enough to make me pause, my breath catching again as I tried once more, a little more firmly this time, and the ring did not move. I froze, my fingers still against it, my pulse suddenly loud in my ears, because that small, simple action should have been easy, automatic, something I did without thinking, and the fact that it was not, the fact that it stayed exactly where it was, made something inside me shift in a way I could not ignore. Slowly, I lifted my gaze back to him, my expression no longer just confused, no longer just uncertain, but something deeper now, something closer to realization, and he met my eyes without hesitation, without surprise. Like this was exactly what he had expected. "It fits," he said quietly, and the weight of those words settled over me in a way that made it impossible to pretend this was still just a mistake, and for the first time since I stepped onto this floor, I felt something close to fear, not of him, but of what I was starting to understand, because whatever I had forgotten, whatever I had walked away from, it had not let go of me, and now it was waiting for me to remember. The word lingered in the air long after he said it, like it had weight, like it carried something more than its simple meaning, and I stood there staring at him, my fingers still resting against the ring that refused to move, my mind trying to catch up with a reality that no longer felt stable. It fits. The simplicity of it should have made it easy to dismiss, but it did the opposite. It made everything harder, because it suggested something undeniable, something physical, something real that I could not explain away with logic or coincidence. I pulled my hand back slightly, as if distance might help me think, my breath uneven now, not panicked, not out of control, but no longer steady either, and I realized I was no longer trying to prove him wrong. I was trying to understand how he could be right. "No," I said quietly, though the word lacked conviction, more reflex than belief, and I shook my head again, slower this time, my gaze drifting past him for just a second as I tried to find something familiar in the space, something grounded. But there was nothing, only the same controlled silence, the same watchful presence of the men in the distance, the same feeling that I had stepped into a place that operated on rules I did not know. "This does not mean anything," I added, but even as I said it, I knew that was no longer true, because the ring meant something, even if I did not understand what, and the way he was watching me, not pressing, not forcing, just waiting, made it clear that he knew exactly what it meant. "It means you stayed," he said, and the words landed differently than anything else he had said so far, not confusing, not impossible, but heavy, like they were tied to something real, something that existed whether I remembered it or not. And my chest tightened again, that same pressure building as if something inside me was pushing against the walls I had built around it. "Stayed." The word echoed in my mind, and with it came another flicker, sharper this time, not just a feeling but a fragment, a glimpse of standing in a room that felt just like this one, the same polished floor, the same quiet. My hand resting on a surface I could not quite see, my voice saying something soft, something certain, and then his voice, closer than it was now, responding in a way that made my chest tighten in the same way it was tightening now. I inhaled sharply, the memory slipping away before I could hold on to it, leaving me standing there again, present, but not entirely, and I felt my fingers curl slightly, instinctively, as if trying to hold on to something that was no longer there. "I did not stay," I said, more firmly now, pushing back against the fragment, against the pull that was starting to feel too real. I would not just stay somewhere like this without remembering it, without knowing why. The argument felt weaker than before, but I held on to it anyway, because it was the only thing I had left that made sense. He studied me for a moment, his expression unchanged, but his gaze sharper now, more focused, like he was watching the shift happen in real time, like he could see the cracks forming even if I tried to ignore them, and then he took a small step closer. Not enough to trap me, not enough to corner me, just enough to make the space between us feel intentional, and my breath caught again, not because I felt threatened, but because I felt seen in a way I could not explain. "You stayed because you chose to," he said, his voice lower now, quieter, but no less certain, and the calmness of it made it impossible to dismiss as manipulation or assumption. It sounded like truth, like something he had watched happen, like something he had been part of. I shook my head again, but slower this time, less certain, because the more he spoke, the more the pieces inside me shifted, not falling into place yet, but moving, aligning in ways that made it harder to deny. "Then why would I leave?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, softer than I intended, more honest than anything I had said so far, and for the first time, his gaze softened just slightly, not enough to lose that control, but enough to change the weight of the moment, and when he answered, his voice carried something different, something that felt closer to the truth than anything else. "Because you thought it would protect me," he said, and the words hit something deep inside me, something that reacted before I could understand it, my chest tightening sharply, my breath catching as another fragment flickered at the edge of my mind, stronger than before. Closer, like it was about to surface completely, and I realized then that I was no longer just standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was standing in the middle of something I had already lived through, something I had already chosen, and the only thing more unsettling than that was the growing certainty that I was about to remember why. The words settled into me before I could stop them, before I could argue or reject or push them away like everything else he had said, and that was what made them different, what made them dangerous, because they did not feel like something new. They felt like something remembered. "Protect me." The phrase echoed in my chest, quiet but persistent, and for a second the world around me seemed to blur at the edges, the polished floor, the distant figures, even him, all fading just enough for something else to surface, something closer, something mine. I saw it then, not clearly, not completely, but enough to make my breath catch, a room like this one but warmer somehow, the light softer, my voice low and unsteady saying something I could not fully hear, and his response, closer, quieter, telling me I did not have to do this, that I could stay, that he would handle whatever it was I was afraid of, and then my own voice again. Stronger this time, certain in a way I did not feel now, saying no, saying this was the only way, saying that if I stayed, it would only make things worse for him. My chest tightened sharply as the fragment slipped away, leaving behind nothing but the feeling of it, the weight of a decision I did not remember making, but could somehow feel in my bones. I blinked, the present snapping back into focus, and I realized I was breathing faster now, my hand still raised slightly as if reaching for something that was no longer there, and when I looked at him, really looked this time, something had changed, not in him, but in me, in the way I saw him, because the stranger I had been trying to argue with moments ago no longer felt entirely unfamiliar. "I said that," I whispered, the words barely forming, more realization than question, and he did not interrupt, did not confirm immediately, just watched me with that same steady focus that now felt less like control and more like recognition. Like he had been waiting for me to reach this point on my own. "You did," he said quietly after a moment, and the calm certainty in his voice did not feel intrusive anymore. It felt grounding, like something I could hold onto as everything else shifted around me. I shook my head slightly, not in denial this time, but in disbelief, trying to reconcile the version of myself I knew with the one I was starting to glimpse, the one who had stood here before and made a choice that had somehow erased itself from my memory. "Why would I think that leaving would protect you?" I asked, my voice unsteady again, because that part still did not make sense, that part still felt like a gap I could not bridge, and he studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable but intent, like he was weighing how much to give me, how much I was ready to understand. "Because you knew what this place is," he said finally, his voice low, measured, "and you knew what it attracts." The words were simple, but they carried something heavier underneath, something that pressed against the edges of my understanding without fully revealing itself, and I felt that same flicker again, sharper this time, a sense of urgency. Of standing at the edge of something I could not control, of knowing that staying meant risking something more than myself. My fingers tightened slightly, my gaze dropping to the ring again, and this time it did not feel entirely foreign. It felt like a reminder, like proof of something I had chosen even if I could not remember choosing it, and when I looked back up at him, the question that had been forming since the beginning finally surfaced, clearer now, unavoidable. "And you let me go," I said, and there was something in my voice I did not recognize, something softer, something that carried the weight of that forgotten moment, and for the first time since I had stepped onto this floor, something in his expression shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore, not loss of control, never that, but something deeper, something quieter, like a memory he had never let go of. He held my gaze, and for a second, the silence between us felt different again, not empty, not heavy, but full, like it carried everything that had happened before I could remember it, and when he answered, his voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Something that made my chest tighten all over again. "I did not stop you," he said, and the difference between those two things settled into me slowly, but once it did, I understood it in a way I could not ignore, and that understanding brought with it a realization that felt heavier than anything else so far. Because it meant that whatever choice I had made back then, whatever reason I had for leaving, he had respected it enough to let me walk away, and now, standing here again, the question was no longer what had happened before, it was whether I was about to make the same choice twice. The realization did not come all at once, it settled slowly, like something inevitable finally catching up to me, and I stood there in the quiet of that floor, feeling the weight of a choice I could not remember making but somehow understood, and that was what made it different now, what made it impossible to ignore, because before, I had been reacting, denying, trying to hold on to what I knew, but now I was standing in something I had already lived, already decided, and the only thing left was whether I would follow the same path again. I looked at him, really looked this time, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as someone who had been part of something I had once believed in strongly enough to walk away from, and that thought alone made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with something heavier. Something that felt like responsibility. "You knew I would come back," I said quietly, the words forming without hesitation, not because I was certain, but because it felt like the only explanation that made sense now, and he did not answer right away, did not confirm or deny. Just watched me with that same steady focus that had never wavered, and in that silence, I understood something else, something that had been there from the beginning, but I had been too distracted to see. He had not been waiting for just anyone. He had been waiting for me. The thought settled into place with a clarity that made everything else shift around it, and I felt my fingers relax slightly at my side, the tension easing not because the situation was resolved, but because I was no longer fighting it the same way. "Or you made sure I would," I added, a slight edge returning to my voice, not accusatory, but searching, because that mattered, the difference between chance and intention, between coincidence and control, and for the first time, something in his expression changed just enough to answer without words, not guilt, not denial, but something quieter, something that acknowledged the question without fully responding to it. "The elevator," I said slowly, my thoughts aligning as I spoke them, "it should not have come here without access, and yet it did." The logic was simple, almost obvious now, and the more I followed it, the more it led back to him, to this floor, to this moment that felt less like an accident with every second that passed. He did not interrupt, did not correct me, just listened, and that alone told me more than any denial would have. I exhaled slowly, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting back to meet his, and this time, I did not feel the same resistance, the same instinct to pull away, because something had shifted inside me. Something that felt like recognition finally catching up to reality. "So this was not a mistake," I said, not asking, not anymore, just stating it as I understood it now, and the words felt different on my tongue, heavier, more certain, and when he finally spoke, his voice was as calm as it had been from the start. But now I could hear something else beneath it, something that had been there all along. "No," he said simply, and the truth of it settled between us without resistance, without conflict, just existing in a way that felt undeniable. I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acceptance, because arguing it no longer made sense, not when everything around me pointed to the same conclusion. Not when even my own reactions were starting to align with something I did not fully remember but could no longer ignore. I glanced down at the ring again, the silver catching the light in a way that felt almost deliberate, and this time, instead of trying to remove it, I simply let my fingers rest against it, feeling the weight of it, the presence of it, and for the first time, it did not feel entirely foreign. When I looked back up at him, my voice was steady, not because I had all the answers, but because I had finally accepted the question. Then this time, I said quietly, holding his gaze without hesitation, "I decide differently." The words lingered in the space between us, not a promise, not yet, but something close, something that carried the weight of what had been and the possibility of what could change. And as the silence settled again, I realized that whatever had started with a wrong button and a closed door was no longer about how I got here. It was about what I was willing to remember and, more importantly, what I was willing to choose now.